Pam Bondi walked into court expecting justice. Instead, Judge Dalton smirked, slammed his gavel, and dropped a bombshell. "You're fined $10,000. No arguments, no appeal." The room went dead silent. Gasps echoed. Even the city attorney looked stunned. Most people would panic. Pam? She just sat back and smiled. Because in that moment, she knew something Dalton didn't. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. What happened next sent shockwaves through the entire justice system, exposed a secret no one saw coming, and left the courtroom in absolute chaos. Stay till the end, because this story changes everything. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The wooden gavel slammed down, its sharp crack echoing through the silent courtroom. "All rise," the bailiff announced, but the tension had already settled thick as smoke in the air. Pam Bondi sat at the defendant's table, her fingers flipping through neatly organized notes. To her, this was just another routine hearing, until it wasn't. Judge Raymond Dalton entered, his tall, broad-shouldered frame stiff with authority. There was no greeting, no pleasantries, just the cold, clipped efficiency of a man who believed his power was absolute. "This court finds the defendant in violation of Local Statute 14B and is subject to an immediate fine of $10,000. The words landed like a hammer. A ripple of gas spread through the gallery. Even the city attorney, seated across from Pam, furrowed his brow in confusion. No arguments, no deliberation. Pam blinked once, then twice. Had she heard him correctly? Slowly, she set her pen down, her expression calm. Too calm. "Your Honor," she said, voice even, measured. "With all due respect, we haven't even presented arguments yet." Judge Dalton barely glanced up, his lips curling into a smirk. "You won't need to." He leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the bench. "The law is clear." Pam exhaled through her nose. There it was. The arrogance. The unchecked judicial overreach. The assumption that no one, especially not her, would dare to challenge him. She could feel the courtroom shifting, eyes flickering between her and the judge. Some of the jurors looked uneasy, sensing the imbalance. The gallery had gone completely silent, waiting to see if Pam would fold under pressure. Instead, she smiled. Not a smirk, not arrogance, just a slow, knowing smile. She leaned forward, meeting Dalton's gaze head-on. "Well, Your Honor," she said, tapping her fingers lightly on the table, "I suppose it's time to prove you wrong." The judge's smirk falters as Pam sets her sights on dismantling his ruling, piece by piece. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Pam Bondi, unshaken, adjusted her blazer and slowly rose to her feet, her movements precise, deliberate. She wasn't rattled. She was calculating. She placed both hands on the defense table, leveling a cool gaze at Judge Dalton. "Your Honor, is it standard practice in this courtroom to find defendants before hearing their defense?" A murmur spread through the spectators. Even the court stenographer hesitated before typing. Judge Dalton's expression hardened, his smirk faltering for the first time. "This case is cut and dry," he replied, voice clipped. Pam's eyes narrowed slightly. There it was, his attempt to shut her down without justification. She tilted her head and took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Then you won't mind if I cite legal precedent that says otherwise?" The courtroom stirred. Dalton blinked. The city attorney, seated at the prosecution's table, shifted uncomfortably. He had been silent up until now, probably hoping to cruise through an easy, uncontested win. Not anymore. Dalton's fingers tightened around his gavel, but he didn't strike it. He knew that would make him look weak. "This court does not entertain theatrics," he snapped, his voice sharp, dismissive. Pam raised a single eyebrow. She paused, just for a beat, letting the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. Then she took a slow breath and delivered her next sentence like a perfectly aimed shot. "Oh, this isn't theatrics, Your Honor. This is called due process." A ripple of reaction swept through the room. The city attorney picked up his pen, scribbling something down nervously. The jurors, who had seemed indifferent before, were now paying close attention. Pam had just turned the tables. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was questioning the very integrity of the judge sitting on the bench. Judge Dalton's jaw tightened. He gripped his gavel so hard his knuckles turned white. Pam had just cornered him. The real fight was about to begin. Judge Dalton's fingers tightened around his gavel, his jaw clenching so hard it looked like it might crack. He wasn't used to being questioned. especially not in his own courtroom. Pam Bondi stood tall, unwavering. She could see it in his eyes. He was rattled. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The audience sat at the edge of their seats, waiting for someone to break it. Dalton was the first to speak. His voice was sharp, laced with irritation. "Ms. Bondi, I don't need a lecture on how my courtroom operates." Pam remained unshaken. If anything, she looked amused. She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "I'm not lecturing, Your Honor," she said, her tone even, measured. "I'm reminding you of the law." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dalton's eyes narrowed. His gavel hovered just inches above his desk. It was a silent warning, a desperate attempt to keep control. Pam knew better. This was a power struggle now. Dalton leaned forward, his voice lowering into a growl. "Fine. Present your case, but this won't change a thing." Pam smiled. Not a smug smile, not arrogance, but confidence. She already knew she had won. Slowly, she reached down, unbuckled her briefcase, and pulled it onto the table. The click of the latch echoed through the room. Dalton swallowed, his fingers twitching slightly against the gavel. The tension in the room grew thicker. The city attorney adjusted his tie, suddenly looking uncomfortable. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keyboard, anticipating something big. Pam didn't rush. She took her time, savoring the moment. Finally, she reached inside her briefcase and pulled out a stack of neatly printed legal documents. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Whatever was in those papers, Judge Dalton wasn't going to like it. The weight of the moment pressed down on the courtroom like a storm brewing on the horizon. Pam Bondi, calm and composed, placed the thick legal document onto the defense table with precision, as if she had just revealed a checkmate move in a high-stakes chess game. "Tinkerville, Des Moines, 1969, she said smoothly, her voice carrying across the silent room. Judge Dalton's fingers twitched against his gavel. His face, once smug and unshaken, hardened into a deep scowl. "That case is irrelevant," he snapped, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. Pam raised a single eyebrow, her confidence unwavering. "Actually, Your Honor, it proves that an individual does not shed their constitutional rights in a government institution." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The city attorney, who had been trying to stay uninvolved, suddenly leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. Dalton's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Pam was doing. Pam, undeterred, continued. "The Supreme Court ruled that constitutional protections do not magically disappear when someone enters a school, a courtroom, or any government space. The ruling was clear. Rights remain intact. Due process remains intact." Her voice was steady, unwavering, but the weight of her words shook the very foundation of the courtroom. Judge Dalton cleared his throat, gripping the armrest of his chair as if holding on to his authority by a thread. "That case has no bearing here," he insisted. Pam tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Then why does it directly contradict the fine you issued against me?" Dalton's nostrils flared. Pam leaned forward, hands resting lightly on the table. "You fine me under a statute that violates my constitutional rights. An unenforceable law, Your Honor." The gallery buzzed with murmurs. Several members of the jury exchanged glances. The weight of realization was settling in. Dalton could feel it. His control was slipping. The city attorney's face had gone noticeably pale. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, waiting for the next bombshell. Pam sat back in her chair, crossing her arms slowly, her gaze locked onto Dalton like a predator watching its prey. The judge was cornered, and he knew it. Dalton's glare darkened. Pam had just exposed him, in his own courtroom, and now the whole room knew it. A heavy silence hung over the courtroom like an approaching storm. Judge Dalton's grip on his gavel tightened, his knuckles turning pale. The weight of Pam Bondi's argument had shifted the atmosphere, and he felt it, the slow, creeping realization that he was losing control. Dalton exhaled sharply, as if trying to shake off the pressure. His gaze flickered across the room, scanning the faces of the jury, the spectators, the court staff. They weren't looking at Pam with doubt anymore. They were looking at him. The city attorney, who had been silent for most of the hearing, finally spoke. His voice was careful, almost hesitant. "Your Honor, perhaps we should review." Dalton's head snapped toward him. His glare could cut through steel. "The ruling stands." His voice was clipped, laced with irritation. Pam didn't so much as blink. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her expression composed, almost bored. Then I'll be filing an appeal and taking this to the Supreme Court. The words crashed into the room like a sledgehammer. Everything stopped. The murmurs vanished. The court stenographer paused mid-keystroke. Even the bailiff, a man who had likely seen years of legal battles, shifted uncomfortably where he stood. Pam wasn't bluffing. Everyone could tell. Dalton's face twitched. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked unsure. Pam folded her hands on the table, watching him, waiting. Dalton swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He needed to regain control before it slipped through his fingers completely. With no other move left, he slammed his gavel down. Hard. "This court is in recess!" Gasps rippled through the room. Pam didn't move. She simply tilted her head, as if she had been expecting it. Dalton pushed back from his chair abruptly, his face flushed, his breathing shallow. He had no defense, no counter-argument. But recess wasn't just a delay, it was a strategy. Dalton stormed toward his chambers. He wasn't retreating. He was planning something. The courtroom doors swung open with a weighty creak, breaking the tense silence. Every head in the room turned as a tall, silver-haired man strode in, his crisp black robe flowing behind him like a battle flag. Judge Allen Whitaker. A collective murmur rippled through the spectators. Unlike Dalton, Whitaker wasn't just some local judge. He was a heavyweight in the legal system, respected across the state. Pam Bondi's expression remained calm, unreadable as she watched him take a seat beside Dalton at the bench. Judge Dalton, his confidence restored, finally allowed himself a smirk. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching Pam closely. This was his play. By bringing in a senior judge, Dalton was trying to reassert dominance, to make Pam feel outmatched, outgunned. But Pam, she was already 2 steps ahead. Whitaker cleared his throat, his deep voice steady, commanding. "Miss Bondi, I understand you've raised some procedural concerns." The judge's tone was even, neutral. But Pam caught the slight hesitation, the calculated phrasing. This wasn't just an inquiry. This was a test. She sat back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, with slow, deliberate confidence. "I appreciate your time, Your Honor," she said smoothly. Then with a small, knowing smile, she added, "Are you here to clarify the law or to bend it?" A sharp inhale came from the gallery. Dalton's smirk vanished. His fingers twitched slightly against the armrest of his chair. Whitaker's gaze sharpened. His years on the bench had trained him to spot when someone was bluffing. Pam wasn't bluffing. She knew Whitaker's record. She had read his rulings, studied his decisions. If he played fair, she could handle him. If he tried to cover for Dalton, he'd be making the biggest mistake of his career. A heavy beat of silence followed, thick with unspoken tension. Then Whitaker leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. His next words would change everything. "Ms. Bondi, I assume you've prepared for this. Let's see just how confident you really are." The air in the courtroom thickened, the tension practically tangible as Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his fingers interlocked on the bench. His gaze, sharp and analytical, settled on Pam Bondi. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice measured, "you claim this fine violates due process. Are you aware that courts have discretion in enforcement?" Dalton sat back slightly, a smug smirk creeping onto his face. This was the lifeline he was waiting for. Whitaker reinforcing the idea that judges held the final say. But Pam didn't flinch. She didn't even hesitate. Instead, she nodded confidently. "Discretion, Your Honor, isn't immunity from legal standards." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even a few jurors exchanged quick glances, sensing the shift in momentum. Pam lifted a document from her case file and set it gently on the table, tapping her finger against the highlighted section. "Gas vs. Lopez, 1975. Whitaker's brows lifted ever so slightly. The case wasn't just relevant, it was foundational. Pam continued, her voice clear and unwavering. "The Supreme Court ruled that government institutions cannot arbitrarily deprive individuals of rights without proper notice and an opportunity to be heard. That applies to fines just as much as it does to school suspensions." She leaned back slightly, letting the weight of her words settle. "Judge Dalton fined me without warning, without an argument, and without legal basis. That's not discretion. That's a violation." Gasps filled the room. Whitaker's expression shifted. the first sign that he was considering her argument. The city attorney looked visibly rattled, flipping through his notes as if scrambling for a counterpoint. Dalton, however, was not scrambling. He was boiling. His face darkened, his fingers digging into the wood of the bench. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Whitaker exhaled through his nose, slow and thoughtful. People are too sensitive these days. It was just a joke. And suddenly my entire career is over? For the first time in days, he felt like he had control again. But Diane wasn't playing along. She lifted a single eyebrow. So mocking someone's faith on national television is just a joke to you? Elliot's smirk faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly. Look, comedians joke about religion all the time. Why am I the one being crucified? The audience wasn't buying it. Live comments started flooding the screen. He's not sorry. He's just mad he got caught. This isn't cancel culture. It's consequences. You made your bed. Now lie in it. Diane leaned forward slightly, flipping through her notes. And then came the knockout question. Tell me, Elliot, would you mock someone's cultural background the same way? The air shifted. Elliot blinked, suddenly uncomfortable. He knew exactly what she was implying. If he said no, he'd be admitting to double standards. If he said yes, he'd be digging his own grave. Sweat gathered at his brow. The silence stretched too long. Finally, he scoffed. You're twisting my words. This is a hit piece. His voice had risen, too defensive, too aggressive. Diane simply tilted her head, unfazed. The chat exploded. Oh, he's spiraling. She got him with one question. Man just self-destructed on live TV. Elliot's face twisted in frustration. His PR team had told him to back down, to be humble. But his ego wouldn't allow it. With a sharp tug, he ripped off his mic, tossed it onto the desk, and stormed off the set. The internet explodes again, and this time, it's the final nail in Elliot's coffin. The anticipation was unlike anything the network had ever seen. For days, billboards, commercials, and social media teasers had hyped up the debut of the debate room's new era. And now, the moment had arrived. As the clock struck 0, millions of viewers around the world held their breath. The screen faded from black. Then Shaq appeared, dressed in a tailored black suit, seated in the center of the grand studio. He didn't need gimmicks, flashy intros, or dramatic music. Instead, he simply looked into the camera, his deep voice cutting through the silence. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. For a full second, there was silence. Then, the studio erupted into applause. The energy was electric, a historic night in television. The viewership numbers climbed faster than anyone predicted. Within the first 10 minutes, the broadcast had surpassed the ratings of Elliot's final episode. By the halfway mark, it was breaking network records. Social media was on fire. Shaq, the GOAT, best host ever. The real debate starts now. A viral tweet summed it up best. He turned an insult into an empire. Celebrities, athletes, and journalists all chimed in. LeBron James tweeted, "A man of integrity takes the W, proud of you, Shaq." Even brands jumped in. Nike posted, "We stand with those who lead by example." Congrats to Shaq on his first episode. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit apartment across town, Elliot Graves sat motionless on his couch, staring at the screen. His phone, once overflowing with calls, deals, and opportunities, was now completely silent. The network that once revolved around him, now it was Shaq's. His hands clenched into fists, but he didn't reach for his phone, because for the first time there was no one left to call. The ratings are so high that Shaq officially becomes the face of the network. Elliot Graves had once been a household name. Now, he was a ghost. While Shaq's show continued to dominate the airwaves, drawing in millions of viewers per night, Elliot sat alone in a dimly lit home studio, desperately trying to claw his way back into relevance. He had convinced himself that people just needed time, that eventually they'd come crawling back, begging for his unfiltered takes and hard-hitting debates. So he launched a podcast. It was supposed to be his big comeback, his chance to tell his side of the story without network interference. He even called it Uncanceled with Elliot Graves, a title he thought was clever, rebellious. The reality, no one cared. The first episode barely scraped together 5,000 views. The next, less than 1,000. By the third episode, he refreshed the analytics page in disbelief. 50 views. 50. The number stared back at him, mocking him. The live chat was even worse. "Bro, just give up. LMAO, not even bots are watching this. Imagine ruining your career for nothing." Elliot slammed his laptop shut, his hands trembling. This couldn't be happening. He had built an empire. But as he reached for his phone, hoping for a text, a call, anything, he realized something chilling. There was nothing. No missed calls from producers. No emails from sponsors. Not even a courtesy check-in from his former colleagues. He had been completely erased. Meanwhile, Shaq's show continued to soar. His episodes were breaking records. See it in his rigid posture, the way his jaw clenched as he scanned the gallery. He had spent his career controlling the narrative in his courtroom, ruling with unchecked authority. But today he wasn't in control. She walked toward her table, but just before she sat, a rustle of movement in the back of the room caught her eye. A journalist had arrived. Front row seat, notebook in hand, eyes locked on the bench. Pam smiled to herself. The story had leaked. Dalton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, catching sight of the cameras now recording in the gallery. His face paled. He gripped his gavel like a lifeline, his fingers digging into the polished wood. Whitaker, the senior judge called in for damage control, cleared his throat. "Ms. Bondi, you may proceed." Pam rose, moving with purpose. She didn't rush, didn't falter. The weight of what she was about to do carried its own power. "Your Honors, before we continue, I'd like to introduce one final piece of evidence." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick, bound legal document, the kind that held irrefutable proof. She laid it gently on the table, tapping its cover. "This is a review of Judge Dalton's rulings over the last 5 years, specifically every case where he imposed an arbitrary fine without legal grounds." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Dalton sat up straight, his face a mask of forced neutrality. But his eyes, they were panicked. Pam flipped open the first page. "What I found is disturbing. More than a dozen cases, each one mirroring what happened today." She let the weight of her words sink in. Unjustified fines, no legal basis, no due process, just an abuse of power. Dalton's face darkened. "This is out of line." Pam lifted a single hand, stopping him cold. "And yet, it's all documented." She turned toward Whitaker. "Your Honor, I'm filing an official request for judicial review. If this court values justice, Judge Dalton's record must be investigated." The entire room went silent. Whitaker stared at the documents, flipping through them. His expression grew colder with each passing second. Then he slowly turned to Dalton. "Judge Dalton, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Dalton gritted his teeth. His hands were shaking now. The cameras were still rolling. Pam leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "I think we're done here." Dalton swallowed hard. His career might not survive this. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Judge Raymond Dalton, but the damage had already been done. His usually commanding presence had crumbled under the weight of public exposure, and now he was nothing more than a disgraced figure trying to hold on to the last threads of his authority. Pam Bondi adjusted her blazer with a slow, satisfied breath. The courtroom buzzed in whispers, but she paid them no mind. She had done what needed to be done. Now it was Dalton's fate that hung in the balance. Meanwhile, the outside world was already reacting. The first headlines hit the internet within minutes. Judge Dalton's shocking abuse of power exposed in real time. Pam Bondi versus the system, and she's winning. Judicial corruption? Legal experts call for Dalton's suspension. Social media exploded with clips from the trial. The moment Dalton stammered under pressure, the moment Whitaker turned against him, the moment Pam called for his investigation. Justice for Pam started trending. Dalton exposed climbed the charts. TV networks called in legal analysts to dissect what had just unfolded. On a primetime panel, one analyst shook his head in disbelief. This wasn't just a bad ruling. Judge Dalton knowingly ignored due process. That's a serious violation of judicial ethics. Another expert chimed in, more bluntly, if the review board does their job, Dalton is finished. And they did. By the next morning, the Judicial Review Board had launched an official investigation. Dalton's name, once untouchable, was now a stain on the system. His previous rulings were being scrutinized. Other lawyers were stepping forward, claiming they too had been unfairly fined in his courtroom. Then the final blow. A breaking news alert flashed across the screen. Judge Dalton suspended pending investigation. Pam read the words as she stepped out of the courthouse, her heels clicking against the pavement. A deep sense of victory settled in her chest. But just as she took a breath, her phone buzzed. She glanced down. A block number. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. A deep, unfamiliar voice spoke on the other end. Ms. Bondi, I think you'll want to hear this. Pam's victory isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, flashing cameras and a sea of voices shouting questions. Pam Bondi stepped into the sunlight, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had just taken down one of the most arrogant, corrupt judges in the system, but as she looked across the frenzy of journalists and onlookers, she realized this was bigger than just one case. The public had seen everything. The way Dalton had abused his power, the way the courtroom had turned against him, the way Pam had refused to back down, forcing the system to hold him accountable. And now, people wanted more. A journalist pushed forward, microphone extended. Ms. Bondi, your case has set a major precedent. Judges across the country are being forced to review their courtroom procedures. How does it feel to spark a national conversation? Pam met the woman's gaze, her voice steady. It's about time, the crowd murmured in agreement. Legal analysts were already calling it the Bondi effect, a wave of courtroom challenges popping up across the country. Lawyers were stepping forward, filing complaints against judges who had ruled unfairly for years. Courtrooms were tightening their procedures, terrified of ending up on the front page like Judge Dalton. The system was being shaken at its core. Pam's phone buzzed in her hand. A new email. Subject, National Legal Reform Committee, we need you. Her breath caught for half a second. The message was from a high-profile legal advocacy group, asking her to take her fight to the national stage. They wanted her to work on reforming courtroom procedures, not just for herself, but for thousands of people who had been silenced by corrupt rulings. She had won her case, but this was the real fight. A reporter called out from the crowd, snapping her out of her thoughts. Pam, what's next for you? Pam smiled, slipping her phone back into her pocket. She had already made up her mind. Oh, this is just the beginning. Pam walks away, the fire in her eyes burning brighter than ever. Her battle isn't over. It's only getting started.